The last of the German troops were being driven out of Belgium, and the Allies were preparing for the final phase of the war, the crossing of the Rhine River and the drive into the German heartland. The Allies had every reason to be confident of success. By February 1945, 7 Allied armies stood along 400 miles of German border, ready for the final assault. Bitter fighting followed as the Allies met with unruly weather and resolute German defenders in the Reichswald forest, now transformed by an early thaw into a murky swamp. February 23rd, the Allies were finally able to crack the Siegfried Line. 8,000 Germans had been killed and 12,000 taken prisoner in the battle. The Allies had suffered 6,000 casualties. On March 15th, General Patton launched his attack. His armor churned relentlessly through the countryside, capturing 950 square miles of territory on March 19th alone. The Germans in Patton's sector were in full retreat. By the end of the first day of combat, the Allies had broken through the German lines. On the same day, General Patton drove into Germany. Longtime Phoenix resident Silvestre S. Herrera was fighting near Merzwiller, France. Under heavy machine gun fire, Private Herrera single-handedly attacked and destroyed the German-held position, capturing 8 prisoners. While continuing his attack, Private Herrera triggered a German landmine, losing both feet to the blast. Down, but not out, Private Herrera continued firing, thus allowing his comrades to flank and capture the German position. For his heroic and courageous acts that day, Private Silvestre S. Herrera was awarded the Medal of Honor, the Purple Heart, and Mexico's Order of Military Merit. In World War II, 29 Native Americans from the Navajo Nation enlisted in the United States Marines. They were trained for a top-secret program that would remain classified until 1968. These original code talkers arrived in San Diego in May 1942 for basic training and intensive courses in transmitting messages and radio operation. This first group was responsible for creating the indecipherable Navajo Code. From 1942 to 1945, over 400 Navajo Marines would be trained in the Unbreakable Code. Navajo code talkers served in all 6 Marine divisions, transmitting messages by telephone and radio in their native language. They fought side by side with their brother Marines in all assaults from 1942 to 1945, including Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. They are credited with helping the United States win many key battles in the Pacific. On August 7, 1942, the 1st Marine Division hit the beaches of Guadalcanal along with 15 Navajo code talkers. This was the first battle where the Navajo Code would be tested under battlefield conditions. It was a success. During the next 2 years, Marines would continue shedding blood as they fought their way across the South Pacific, successfully taking one island after another. After months of heavy naval shelling, the Marines hit the beaches in the early morning hours of February 14, 1945. 6 Navajo code talkers, working around the clock during the first 2 days of the battle, received and sent over 800 messages, all without error. Their selfless efforts would continue for the next 34 days until the enemy was finally defeated. Major Howard Connor, 5th Marine Division Signal Officer, declared, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." The code talkers were next thrust into the battle for Okinawa. The clash between American and Japanese forces at Okinawa raged for almost 3 months as the struggle became one of the bloodiest battles of the war, with over 75,000 Allied casualties. Only 10 Navajo code talkers lost their lives in combat, indicating just how vital they were to victory. In 1968, The top-secret Navajo Code was declassified, and for the first time, the United States Marine Corps was able to publicly recognize Navajo Code Talkers for their service and dedication. Over the course of the next 35 years, all Navajo Code Talkers were recognized with the Congressional Gold Medal. The two-year struggle to liberate Italy was destined to go down in history as one of the most brutal battlegrounds of World War II. July 1943. A flotilla of 3,300 Allied ships embarked for Sicily, marking the beginning of the Italian campaign. After more than a month of hard fighting, Sicily belonged to the Allies. September 9, 1943. Salerno. 70,000 men stormed the beaches of the Italian mainland. The fighting was fierce. With the German pullback in mid-September, Salerno belonged to the Allies. Finally, on October 1st, Naples fell. Still, the Germans held on. Then, on May 18th, with one mighty push, the Allies were finally able to claim Cassino and the infamous monastery overlooking the town. The Italian campaign had become an endless nightmare of brutal battles. October 4th, 1944. In the mountains of northeast Italy, Staff Sergeant Manuel Mendoza, known as the Arizona Kid from Miami, Arizona, distinguished himself with acts of gallantry. Already wounded in the arm and leg, he single-handedly held back an all-out German counterattack. He held off and then drove back over 200 attacking German soldiers, killing over 30 and securing the mountaintop. Sergeant Mendoza, for his extraordinary heroism, was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the Bronze Star, and the Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster. On May 2, 1945, after over 20 months of fighting, the longest sustained campaign of World War II was over. It was to be 70 years later, in 2014, that Master Sergeant Manuel V. Mendoza was honored posthumously with the Congressional Medal of Honor. One of the closest held secrets of World War II was the formation and operation of a small group of Hopi Native American Code Talkers. The Hopi Code was first used during the fierce fight for control of Engar Island, Palau. The new code was an immediate success, proving to be a valuable communications tool as the Americans overwhelmed Japanese forces on the island. The Hopi Code Talkers aided in the success of combat operations, including the Marshall Islands, New Caledonia, and the Philippines. 2 of the original 10 Code Talkers were assigned to serve with the Army Air Corps 90th and 380th Bombardment Groups. In March 1943, the Hopi Code was used to send coded orders helping to coordinate strafing and bombing attacks on Japanese naval forces during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The Hopi Code Talkers also played an important role as the 90th and 380th Groups raided oil refineries at Balikpapan, Borneo. The Hopi Code Talkers contributed to the liberation of the South Pacific Islands and the eventual fall of the Japanese Empire. 2 Apache Code Talkers, Private Paul Burdett, a Tonto Apache, codenamed Rebel, and Private Nelson Danford, a White Mountain Apache, codenamed Tartar, were members of the 417th Bombardment Group, which saw its first combat in March of 1944 during the vicious battle for New Guinea. On April 16th, the 417th, with other units of the 5th Air Force, flew missions against multiple Japanese targets, resulting in the destruction of more than 298 Japanese planes. From December 1944 through January 1945, the 417th successfully attacked numerous Japanese convoys, helping to clear the way for the invasion of Luzon. Over the next 7 months, until the surrender of Japanese forces, the 417th supported American forces by continually attacking enemy troops and naval targets from the Philippines to mainland Japan. It would be more than 60 years before Hopi and Apache code talkers were publicly recognized and honored for their dedication and valor with a Congressional Gold Medal. Ira Hayes, from Sackatoon, Arizona, a member of the Gila River Indian community, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps on August 26, 1942. After completion of basic training, he volunteered to become a Marine paratrooper, earning his silver jump wings and a promotion to private first class. Private Hayes was first assigned to the 1st Marine Parachute Regiment. After the land battle on the island of Vella La Vella in the Solomon Islands, Private Hayes took part in the occupation of the island until he was moved north to Bougainville, where the operation against entrenched Japanese troops was already underway. Private Hayes stormed the beach at Bougainville with the 3rd Marine Battalion. Despite prior heavy bombardment from Navy destroyers and planes, the Marines met intense resistance by embedded Japanese troops. Fierce fighting raged for months against the heavily dug-in Japanese forces that numbered more than 50,000. As the fight for Bougainville wound down, American forces prepared to push the war closer to Japan itself. The Japanese island of Iwo Jima endured 9 months of continuous naval bombardment and air raids. Private Hayes' 2nd Platoon, Easy Company, landed on the southern beach below Mount Suribachi on February 19, 1944. The bloody struggle for Iwo Jima had begun. As the Marines hit the beaches in an amphibious assault, the soft volcanic ash slowed their advance to a crawl and made them easy targets for snipers and mountain-based artillery. Casualties were heavy. After the first 4 days of around-the-clock bitter fighting, U.S. Marines finally captured the heavily defended Mount Suribachi, the highest point on the island. The raising of the American flag on Mount Suribachi by 5 Marines, including Private Hayes, on February 23, 1945, was immortalized by AP photographer Joe Rosenthal and became an icon of the World War. It was the first foreign flag to fly above Japanese soil. Easy Company suffered many casualties, and Private Hayes was one of just 5 Marines remaining from his platoon of 45 men. Of the 20,000 Japanese troops on the island, Marines captured only 216 soldiers. The rest were killed in action. Private Hayes and the Marines continued to fight until the island was secured on March 26, 1945. In April, Private Hayes was shipped back to the United States, where he represented the Marine Corps in war bond rallies across the country. After returning to active duty, Private Hayes was reassigned to occupation duty on the Japanese mainland. In February of 1946, he was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat V. Before his untimely death in January 1955, Corporal Ira Hayes returned to Washington, D.C. one last time on November 10, 1954, for the unveiling and dedication of the now iconic Marine Corps War Memorial. On June 25, 1950, the Korean War began, when 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army charged across Korea's 38th parallel. Before the bloody Korean conflict was over, 7 soldiers from Arizona would be honored with the Distinguished Service Cross for their heroic and courageous actions in combat. July 1950. American troops entered the war as part of the United Nations military force to defend South Korea. Lieutenant Richard Eyler from Pima, Arizona, on September 5, 1950, distinguished himself in the battle at Kasan, Korea. Lieutenant Eiler's platoon was pinned down by vicious North Korean machine gun and small arms fire. Over half of his platoon became casualties in the first minutes of the battle. Lieutenant Eiler single-handedly silenced a machine gun emplacement with grenades as his men withdrew under heavy enemy fire. He was seriously wounded as the last of his troops made it to safety. He stayed in place, ordering an artillery barrage on his position. Finally overrun by North Korean troops, Lieutenant Richard Eiler was killed in action, protecting the men under his command. On New Year's Eve 1950, shortly before midnight, Corporal Edward Beale from Cochise, Arizona, and his comrades found themselves surrounded by fast-moving North Korean and Chinese Communist forces near Chuding-ni, a battle that became known as the Chinese New Year Offensive. Corporal Beale, alone and out front, was the first to encounter the enemy onslaught. He poured machine gun fire into the ranks of the enemy, forcing them to withdraw. The enemy began moving to the flank as Corporal Beale caught them by surprise, sweeping his machine gun across the battlefield. The North Koreans were again forced back, leaving 150 dead on the hill in front of his gun. After hours of continuous night fighting, his company was ordered to withdraw. In the early morning hours of January 1st, 1951, Corporal Beale voluntarily remained behind, holding back the advancing enemy. Corporal Edward Beale was killed that day, protecting his fellow soldiers, allowing them to escape. In late July 1951, Sergeant Simon Grigo from Phoenix, Arizona, and Private Edward Lederer of Maricopa, Arizona, found themselves in the same regiment, same division, on the same battlefield near Taisan, Korea. Sergeant Simon Grigo's squad was ordered to attack the well-entrenched North Korean force. The 1st Platoon moved up the rugged hill, coming under devastating automatic weapons, mortar, and small arms fire. They suffered numerous casualties. Sergeant Grigo ordered the evacuation of the wounded as he defended their position from a forward vantage point. Sergeant Simon Grigo would never leave the battlefield, and to this day is still missing in action. 4 days later, on July 30th, 1951, Private Edward Lederer from Maricopa, Arizona, would demonstrate his courage on the battlefield of Taisan, Korea. During an assault on enemy positions, Private Lederer and elements of Company L were pinned down by heavy small arms, automatic weapons, grenade, and mortar fire. Private Lederer, armed with only a machine gun, charged forward onto the battlefield, firing his weapon, resulting in the annihilation and capture of the enemy-held position. Private Edward Lederer was later promoted to sergeant, and in October 1951 received a Silver Star for his heroic actions on Hill 800, known as Heartbreak Ridge. Sergeant Lederer was not the only Arizonan on Heartbreak Ridge. Sergeant George Deemer from Kingman, Arizona, on October 10, 1951, distinguished himself in action against the enemy. Pinned down by heavy mortar and automatic weapons fire, Sergeant Deemer took his place on the skirmish line of the assault squad. Firing his weapon from the shoulder, he destroyed several enemy emplacements and inflicted numerous casualties. Sergeant Deemer then set up his weapon at the crest of the ridge and delivered deadly fire into the counterattacking force until he was mortally wounded. As the war dragged on into its 3rd year, there was no end in sight. On August 15, 1952, in the vicinity of Kyodong, Korea, Corporal Harley Welch of Parker, Arizona, was ordered to attack and secure an important enemy-held position. Corporal Welch and his squad charged the well-entrenched enemy, throwing grenades and directing deadly rifle fire into the North Korean ranks. During the brutal fighting, an enemy grenade landed a few feet from his position. Corporal Welch shouted a quick warning and threw his body on the grenade, sacrificing his life to protect his comrades. On the night of July 13, 1953, in the vicinity of Kumhwa, Korea, Lieutenant Charlie St. Clair from Maricopa, Arizona, was serving in a forward artillery observation post that came under intense enemy attack. As the attacking North Korean troops breached the perimeter, Lieutenant St. Clair called for an artillery strike on himself. During the barrage, Lieutenant St. Clair became separated from his command and was surrounded. Wounded, he remained behind, all the while noting enemy positions and troop concentrations. After 7 harrowing days behind enemy lines, Lieutenant St. Clair was finally able to cross back into Allied-controlled territory, bringing his valuable information back to the 8th Army headquarters and saving countless lives. After 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days, at a loss of more than 54,000 American lives, the Korean War finally came to an end when the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27, 1953. These 7 sons of Arizona, through their courage, heroism, and self-sacrifice, were recognized and honored with the Distinguished Service Cross. 5 Arizonans were honored and recognized in the bloody Korean conflict with the Navy Cross. The Korean War would last 3 years, 1 month, and 2 days, claiming over 54,000 U.S. lives. Among the honored dead were 4,267 U.S. Marines. For the innumerable acts of bravery and courage in the bloody Korean conflict, 266 Naval Crosses, the Navy's highest combat honor, were awarded. November 27, 1950. Over 130,000 Chinese troops stormed across the Yalu River into North Korea with the intent of annihilating all U.S. forces. The infamous battle at the Chosin Reservoir had begun. The next 17 days of hellish fighting would be one of the deadliest and bloodiest in Marine Corps history. Facing overwhelming odds, often fighting in the dead of night, the Marines endured the coldest winter in 100 years, with temperatures reaching 50 below zero. 3 Arizonans, all members of the infamous 1st Marine Division, fought with reckless abandon during the battle. All 3 were awarded the Naval Cross for their courage, heroism, and valor. Only one would survive. Captain Morse Holliday of Tucson, against an aggressive Chinese assault at Hagaru-ri, frequently exposed himself to intense hostile fire to supply his troops with vital ammunition, while at the same time directing and encouraging his command to successfully repel numerous hostile advances. Captain Holloway's command and tactical abilities motivated his troops to counter the enemy's continuous onslaught, maintaining a strong defensive position. The Chinese forces, outnumbering the Marines 10-1, continued their brutal assault at the Chosin Reservoir. 2nd Lieutenant Leslie Williams from Phoenix, Arizona, spearheaded an aggressive frontal attack on a heavily fortified enemy position at Udamni. Lieutenant Williams' quick initiative and leadership in the face of extremely hostile Chinese forces allowed his troops to successfully seize their objective. During the vicious assault, Lieutenant Williams was killed in action. The unending violent assault on the perimeter of Hagaru-ri continued. Corporal Jack Williams of Higley, Arizona, observed the enemy capture and prepared to use one of his company's machine guns. Undaunted by intense enemy fire, Corporal Williams stormed across an unprotected area. He boldly launched a single-handed attack with grenades and rifle fire, killing 3 enemy combatants and recapturing the weapon and turning it on the enemy. While driving the attacking forces back, Corporal Williams was mortally wounded and died on the battlefield. Despite 17 days of misery, suffering, and anguish at the Chosin Reservoir, the war continued. April 1951. U.S. Marine helicopter pilot Captain Frank Wilson from Jerome, Arizona, flew his small unarmed helicopter through heavy ground fire into enemy territory to rescue 3 downed airmen. After securing the flyers, low on fuel and unable to reach a safe altitude, Captain Wilson made the return flight through the narrow valley under constant hostile machine gun and anti-aircraft fire. Captain Wilson, on that day, demonstrated outstanding courage and brilliant flying while selflessly risking his own life to save his fellow airmen. Ever present alongside the Marines on the battlefield were the Naval Corpsmen, affectionately referred to as DOC by combat Marines. 109 were killed in combat during the Korean conflict. Naval Corpsman 3rd Class Donald Hovatter from Yuma, Arizona, was one of these brave and courageous corpsmen. On May 29, 1951, under endless hostile fire, he fearlessly sprinted between wounded Marines on the battlefield. While running to aid a downed Marine, Hovatter was severely wounded. Undeterred and ignoring his own wound, he struggled forward, protecting the injured Marine with his own body. Doc Hovatter was shot a second time, giving his life for a fellow Marine and his country. These 5 heroic and courageous Arizonans were awarded the Naval Cross and will forever be remembered and honored for their sacrifices. Kern W. Dunnigan from Superior, Arizona, joined the United States Army and by May of 1969 was serving in Vietnam as a captain in Company A, 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry Regiment. On May 12, 1969, North Vietnamese Army units launched a major offensive in Quang Tinh province against American-held positions. The assault would grind on for more than 35 grueling hours and claim the lives of 125 U.S. soldiers, with over 460 men seriously wounded. On May 13, 1969, on the second day of the ferocious battle, Captain Dunnigan was leading an attack to relieve enemy pressure on the battalion's forward support base when his company came under intense fire from a well-entrenched NVA battalion. Stopped in the heavy jungle, they successfully fought off wave after wave of relentless North Vietnamese attacks, holding them back with the help of sustained Allied artillery and air support. Intense combat continued throughout the day. As the fighting moved into the evening, NVA mortar attacks increased. Captain Dunnigan was seriously wounded in the face by flying shrapnel, but refused evacuation from the battlefield. Throughout the night of May 13th and the morning of May 14th, the attack was unrelenting as Captain Dunnigan continued to command his troops and supervise the evacuation of the dead and wounded. In spite of his painful wound and extreme fatigue, Captain Dunnigan risked heavy fire on 2 occasions to rescue critically wounded men himself. His second trip onto the battlefield resulted in 2 gunshot wounds received while he was rescuing a pinned-down recon soldier. Again, he refused to be evacuated. Having maneuvered his command into contact with another unit, he learned that a 6-man party from his company was trapped by enemy fire and had not reached the new perimeter. Captain Dunnigan unhesitatingly went back and searched for his men. Finding one soldier critically wounded, Captain Dunnigan, ignoring his own wounds, lifted the man to his shoulders and carried him to the comparative safety of the friendly perimeter. In an effort to aid the company's escape from the North Vietnamese siege, Captain Dunnigan ordered a barrage of incendiary artillery rounds, creating a thick blanket of smoke and an avenue out. In the end, after losing many of his soldiers during 3 days of horrific fighting, Captain Dunnigan and his remaining 42 men were able to escape the enemy onslaught. Captain Kern W. Dunnigan, for his extraordinary heroism and selfless acts of courage, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Oscar P. Austin, from Phoenix, Arizona, enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in April 1968. Austin completed training at Camp Pendleton and was promoted to Private First Class in October 1968. Almost immediately, he received orders to South Vietnam, where he was assigned to the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. PFC Austin, as part of Company E, saw his first combat during Operation Meade River in an area south of Da Nang, nicknamed Dodge City, for its frequent ambushes and firefights. For 19 days, the Marines met fierce resistance. On the morning of November 22nd, the Marines swept in from the west toward a bunker complex known as the Horseshoe. Company E was ambushed as it crossed a small stream. 7 were killed and 23 wounded in 10 minutes before Austin's company could withdraw. After 4 long days of heavy fighting, Marine forces, supported by naval and air bombardment, finally drove the enemy from the area. In January 1969, Operation Lynn River was more of the same for PFC Austin and the 2nd Battalion. For almost 2 weeks, Marines fought non-stop as aggressive enemy attacks took heavy casualties. Operating often at night, the Marines had success against desperate enemy resistance. The Marines' systematic search and sweep tactics resulted in extensive enemy losses of personnel and equipment. Enemy incursions continued in and around the Da Nang Air Base for weeks. During the early morning hours on February 23, 1969, PFC Austin's observation post came under a fierce ground attack by a large North Vietnamese Army force. During the battle, PFC Austin left the security of his foxhole to aid a fallen soldier. Austin, with complete disregard for his own safety, raced across the battlefield to drag the Marine to safety. As he got closer, a grenade landed nearby. Leaping between the grenade and the injured Marine, PFC Austin took the full force of the explosion himself. Although badly injured, he continued forward to help the fallen man. Seeing a North Vietnamese soldier aiming a weapon at the unconscious man, Austin threw himself between the injured Marine and the hostile soldier. In doing so, he courageously gave his life for his fellow Marine. Marine Private First Class Oscar P. Austin, for his heroic actions and selfless devotion to duty, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. At age 17, Nicky Bacon forged his mother's signature and enlisted in the Arizona National Guard. Private Nick Bacon, who grew up in Glendale, Arizona, joined the U.S. Army 1 year later in 1964. After completing basic training, a tour in Germany, and a promotion, Sergeant Bacon volunteered for the first of 2 tours in Vietnam in 1966. Sergeant Bacon ended his first tour of duty in 1967 after a year of fighting against the shadowy Viet Cong in the dense jungles of South Vietnam. Sergeant Bacon was wounded 3 times and narrowly escaped death in a deadly helicopter collision. Due to his extensive combat experience, he was ordered to Hawaii in 1967 to train soldiers who were readying for deployment to Vietnam. As a staff sergeant, he volunteered to return to Vietnam in 1968 as squad leader for the men he had trained. On August 26, 1968, while returning to their base after a month of fighting in the jungle, Sergeant Bacon and his men were expecting hot showers and a steak. Instead, they were ordered aboard helicopters to reinforce members of the 1st Cavalry Division, who were locked in a vicious battle with North Vietnamese forces just south of Da Nang. As Bravo Company's 1st platoon arrived, a North Vietnamese regiment attacked from the flank with mortars and automatic weapons fire. Sergeant Bacon responded with hand grenades, destroying an enemy bunker. Almost immediately, his platoon leader and several other soldiers were wounded in open territory. Sergeant Bacon assumed command of 1st Platoon evacuated the wounded officer to an armored personnel carrier and returned to destroy the machine gun that had wounded members of the platoon. When 3rd Platoon lost its leader moments later, Bacon unhesitatingly assumed command of that platoon and led both platoons against remaining enemy positions. Sergeant Bacon killed 4 enemy soldiers and destroyed an anti-tank gun, allowing U.S. tanks to move forward. He then climbed a nearby tank and directed sustained fire into enemy encampments while the wounded were evacuated to safety. For his actions that day, Sergeant Nicky Daniel Bacon was decorated with the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was also awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Bronze Stars, and 2 Purple Hearts for his service in Vietnam. Phoenix resident Frederick E. Ferguson, following his graduation from high school in 1958, enlisted in the United States Navy. Wanting to fly helicopters, he left the Navy for the Army in 1962, eventually being promoted to warrant officer and receiving his Army aviator wings in May of 1967. Two short weeks later, C.W.O. Ferguson was in Vietnam, assigned to the 227th Aviation Battalion, 1st Cavalry Division. The 1st Air Cav and its helicopters had become a primary assault weapon for the U.S. Army, freeing the infantry to attack the enemy at a time and place of its choosing. C.W.O. Ferguson spent the next 9 months flying 1st Air Cav missions, delivering supplies and troops into hotspots across the region. On January 31, 1968, C.W.O. Ferguson would be thrust into the flight of his life. The Tet Offensive had begun. The combined forces of the North Vietnamese Regular Army and the Viet Cong launched a major offensive on scores of cities and towns across South Vietnam. U.S. forces, caught by surprise, quickly retaliated. Depending heavily on helicopters to move supplies and troops, American and South Vietnamese forces mounted a fierce counterattack. Amid heavy fighting, American soldiers and a UH-1 Huey helicopter were downed inside a South Vietnamese Army compound in the enemy-held city of Hue. Once on the ground, they found themselves surrounded by attacking North Vietnamese. C.W.O. Ferguson, commander of a resupply helicopter monitoring an emergency call from wounded crewmen and soldiers, volunteered to attempt an evacuation. His response drew the attention of other pilots in the region, flanked by attack helicopters doing their best to provide cover from the intense anti-aircraft fire. He landed his aircraft in an extremely confined area in a blinding dust cloud while under heavy mortar and machine gun attack. The firefight raged around them as crew members and soldiers dragged the wounded on board. Although the helicopter was severely damaged by mortar fragments during the loading of the injured men, C.W.O. Ferguson disregarded the damage and flew his crippled aircraft through a hail of fire. Barely clearing the surrounding buildings and treetops, C.W.O. Ferguson pushed his shredded helicopter back to the base at Phu Bai, delivering his wounded passengers to medical staff. His extraordinary determination saved the lives of 5 of his comrades. Chief Warrant Officer Frederick Edgar Ferguson, for his conspicuous gallantry and courage under fire and at the risk of his own life, was the first U.S. Army aviator in Vietnam to be awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Jose Francisco Jimenez from Eloy, Arizona, joined the U.S. Marines in 1968. In the same week he graduated from high school, Jose Jojo Jimenez left for Marine Boot Camp. Completing his training at Camp Pendleton, Private Jimenez was ordered to Vietnam in February 1969, where he was assigned as a fire team leader with the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. Private Jimenez's first action was during a 3-month operation carried out by U.S. Marines and ARVN forces in a clear and search operation, part of the Tet counteroffensive campaign in the hills southwest of Da Nang. From March until June 1969, Allied forces engaged the enemy in a series of pitched battles supported by artillery, tanks, and air support to clear the jungle of North Vietnamese forces and disrupt communications. Showing leadership skills during his first 4 months in the field, Private Jimenez was promoted to corporal in June 1969. On August 28, 1969, during search and destroy operations south of Da Nang, Corporal Jimenez and his fire team left from a helicopter directly into a hot landing zone. Coming under heavy fire by NVA regulars entrenched in the tree line surrounding the landing area. With no place to take cover, the fire team took immediate casualties. Corporal Jimenez hit the ground running, taking the attack directly to the North Vietnamese troops, killing many and taking over an anti-aircraft gun single-handedly. To protect the wounded troops still pinned down in the landing zone, he moved to clear more NVA troops from the tree line. During the heavy fighting, while protecting the wounded and defending his fellow Marines, Corporal Jimenez was tragically cut down by enemy machine gun fire and killed in action. His actions that day inspired his men to push forward, driving North Vietnamese forces from the field, saving the lives of many brave Marines. Corporal Jose Francisco Jimenez, for his courageous actions in selflessly sacrificing himself for his comrades and country, was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. Billy Lane Laufer grew up in Tucson, Arizona, and shortly after his 17th birthday, in 1962, enlisted in the United States Army. Over the next 4 years, Private Laufer served in Korea and Germany as an infantryman, and in the fall of 1966, he volunteered for a combat assignment in Vietnam. He was immediately assigned to the 1st Air Cavalry, which had been ordered to join Operation Thayer, the largest air assault operation of the entire war. After heavy and vicious B-52 airstrikes in and around the Kim Son Valley to soften entrenched enemy forces, General John Norton airlifted 5 battalions into the mountainous jungle highlands surrounding the valley. The Americans then descended into the lowlands, hoping to catch large numbers of North Vietnamese regulars by surprise. Private Laufer's unit was airlifted into a combat landing zone in the Binh Dinh province. Shortly after their arrival, they were ordered into the jungle to engage the enemy. PFC Laufer's unit came under automatic weapons fire almost immediately by North Vietnamese regulars. The surprise attack pinned down the unit as they took heavy casualties. Private Laufer, hoping to draw enemy fire, rose to his feet and single-handedly charged the enemy emplacements, creating a diversion so his comrades could move the wounded to safety. As a result of this selfless act, Private Laufer was fatally wounded. He died just 1 month shy of his 21st birthday, having been in Vietnam less than 7 days. Private Laufer's gallantry at the cost of his own life served as an inspiration to his comrades and saved the lives of an untold number of his wounded companions. Private Billy Lane Laufer was posthumously awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor and the Purple Heart. Vietnam, January 1968. The Tet Offensive had begun. Catching U.S. and South Vietnamese forces by surprise, over 180,000 North Vietnamese regulars and Viet Cong troops simultaneously attacked both civilian and military targets throughout South Vietnam. At the end of April, after months of counterattacks, Marines stationed just south of the DMZ were ordered to reconsolidate their forces at the Forward Operations Base and Airfield in Dong Ha. Strategically positioned along the infamous Highway 1, 10 miles south of the DMZ and close to the mouth of the Qua Viet River, Dong Ha was the last defense against the NVA's aggressive push south. U.S. Marine Captain J. Vargas of Winslow, Arizona, was in command of Company G of the 4th Marines. His unit, positioned along the demilitarized zone, was ordered to be airlifted back to Dong Ha, but after repeated heavy attacks on the landing zone, Captain Vargas and his men were ordered to redeploy on foot. As they made their way along a narrow jungle trail, they encountered persistent enemy artillery bombardment and harassment from North Vietnamese troops. Finally, reaching the base at Dong Ha, Captain Vargas and his men, with very little sleep and no hot meals, were immediately ordered back into battle. Loaded onto amphibious craft, they were taken upriver to take part in the recapture of the village of Dai Do, northeast of the Dong Ha. Captain Vargas was ordered to lead an attack on the enemy fortified village. While crossing a large open rice paddy, the company came under a devastating artillery barrage. When one of Vargas's platoons was split off and pinned down by machine guns, mortar, and artillery rounds, Captain Vargas moved forward, single-handedly destroying 3 machine gun positions, freeing the platoon to rejoin the battle. After repeated attempts to capture and hold the village, Captain Vargas's company was driven back and forced to take cover in the village cemetery. Completely surrounded, he called in for naval gun and air support, protecting his troops with a circle of steel. The fighting raged on throughout the night. The next day, his battalion commander, fighting alongside Captain Vargas, was seriously wounded. Under constant enemy fire, Vargas dragged him to an evacuation point, successfully rescuing his commanding officer. By the end of the 3rd day of battle, the North Vietnamese retreated back into the jungle. Captain Vargas finally allowed himself to be treated for his numerous battle wounds. For his heroism, courage, valor, and leadership on the bloody battlefields of Dai Do, Captain J. Vargas was promoted to Major and awarded the Silver Star, Purple Heart, and Congressional Medal of Honor. Lieutenant Commander John S. McCain, a 3rd-generation graduate of the United States Naval Academy, was trained as a naval aviator. His first combat assignment was to the aircraft carrier USS Forrestal. During the Vietnam War, McCain and his Air Wing participated in numerous aerial campaigns, including Operation Rolling Thunder. In 1967, over the course of 4 days, the planes of the attack carrier Air Wing 17 would fly nearly 150 missions against targets across North Vietnam. On July 29, 1967, while preparing for another mission on the flight deck of the USS Forrestal, a misfired Zuni rocket struck and dislodged the fuel tank of an A-4 Skyhawk. The ruptured tank spilled its fuel, engulfing the deck and McCain's plane in flames. Lieutenant Commander McCain was lucky to escape his burning plane and the 2 huge explosions that ripped through the deck. The tragic fire and ensuing blasts took over 24 hours to contain. 134 brave sailors lost their lives. With the Forrestal out of commission, Lieutenant Commander McCain volunteered for assignment on the USS Oriskany. On September 30th, 1967, he flew his first mission. In less than 3 weeks, McCain would be awarded the Naval Commendation Medal for his efforts in leading an airstrike on the Lac Tri shipyard in Haiphong, Hong, North Vietnam. On October 26, 1967, on his 23rd mission, Lieutenant Commander McCain, along with 19 other planes, left the Oriskany for a raid on a thermal power plant in Hanoi. As the strike group crossed the first line of North Vietnamese defenses, a torrent of anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles was unleashed. Lieutenant Commander McCain's aircraft was struck by a SAM missile. He was forced to eject at low altitude, breaking his leg and shoulder and knocking him unconscious. He landed in a lake just outside the capital. He was pulled ashore by an angry civilian mob and was spat on and beaten before being taken to the infamous prison known as the Hanoi Hilton. POW, Lieutenant Commander McCain was viciously interrogated, brutally tortured, and was initially refused medical treatment.
Lieutenant Commander John McCain.
Once his identity was discovered by the North Vietnamese, he was moved to a hospital and given basic care. McCain was offered an early release in a ploy by the North Vietnamese to look merciful, but he refused, unless every soldier captured before him was released first. Upon his refusal, torture resumed with greater intensity. McCain would be kept prisoner for over 5 years, enduring constant beatings and isolation.
I would just like to tell my wife I will get well. I love her. I hope to see her soon.
Shortly after the peace treaty was signed in Paris, Lieutenant Commander John McCain was released in March of 1973. For his acts of bravery and sheer courage in the face of certain death, Lieutenant Commander John Sidney McCain was awarded the Silver Star, 3 Bronze Stars, and the Purple Heart.